In 2013, Russia introduced an anti-gay propaganda law which alleged to protect kids from homosexuality. Seemingly in response to this, bearded drag queen Conchita Wurst was chosen to represent Austria in the Eurovision Song Contest 2014. Russia's entry that year were basically kids themselves, teenage twins, the Tolmachevi sisters, who themselves hadn't said anything homophobic but became a target for the audience's anger towards Russia. They booed the girls while cheering Conchita.
Thank you very much, Screen.
Despite this, the Russian twins actually found themselves leading the scoreboard, at least to begin with. Conchita gradually made her way up the scoreboard, gaining points from all over Europe, including Russia itself, until finally it became clear, before the last points had even been given, that no one could overtake her.
It's no longer possible for any other country to catch up. We are ready to announce the winner. The winner is Austria!
Conchita Wurst had won the Eurovision Song Contest, the first drag queen and the first openly gay man to win the show.
This night is dedicated to everyone who believes in a future of peace and freedom. You know who you are. We are unity and we are unstoppable.
Conchita performed her song again, but this time the lyrics took on a whole new meaning. She changed the words at the last minute to say, rather than "I will rise up," that "we will rise up." And we all knew this wasn't just a victory for Austria, this wasn't just a victory for Conchita, but for queer people everywhere, for gender non-conforming people. It was a victory for liberation and freedom, a slap in the face for Russia and their homophobic law. And they say Eurovision's not political. The Eurovision Song Contest is commonly considered to be very, very gay. At least it has been for the last few decades. We've had a gay winner, a trans winner, bi winners, lesbian winners. But Eurovision actually has a secret gay history, which goes back to the very beginning. Even when it was impossible for contestants to be out in the 50s and 60s, it was well understood that there were gay performances happening. The gay fans knew who was gay and which gay people were producing songs. Eurovision is also famous for its campness, and the gays do love a bit of camp. But the challenge of bringing open queerness to Eurovision took a surprisingly long time. The first out gay contestant wasn't until 1997, and yet his act is surprisingly heterosexual for one that simultaneously looks so gay. Trans singer Dana International won for Israel in 1998. In 2000, the Israeli band Ping Pong brought both Israeli and Syrian flags on stage as a message of peace, which enraged the Israeli broadcasters so much that they disowned them and said that Ping Pong would have to cover all of the Eurovision expenses on their own. All the drama around flags kind of overshadowed the fact that Ping Pong also gave us the first Eurovision gay kiss. It was just a little peck, but it's there. And that would be both the first and the last gay kiss at Eurovision for a long time. A fun Slovenian drag act brightened up 2002, but 2003 was when the real controversy began. Young people won't remember that Russia was once notorious for its supposedly lesbian teen pop duo t.A.T.u., who took the world by storm by pretending to be girlfriends. I know it's hard to imagine now, but this was a time when Russia's biggest cultural export was probably this supposed pair of teenage lesbians. Russia was hoping that the global popularity of these girls would finally bring them their first Eurovision victory, meaning that Eurovision would then be hosted in Russia the following year. The girls were notorious for being provocative and sexy, and had suggested their Eurovision act would include some of said sexiness. But the Eurovision showrunners said that a backup recording of their dress rehearsal would be made just in case the girls kissed, so it could be censored. This was a family show, they said, and a lesbian kiss would be inappropriate and would lead to a disqualification. Oh yes, such a family show Eurovision is. Nothing sexy or naughty here. Nope, nothing to see here, folks. We all just pray to Jesus during the ad breaks. Effectively, gay kissing had been banned at Eurovision. In the end, Russia didn't win, and t.A.T.u. didn't even attempt to kiss. Nor did they attempt to kiss when Russia finally did host in 2009, and t.A.T.u. reprised their performance with a military choir and flowery tanks. Wow, thank you, Russia. That was so totally normal of you. Good job. But this was 2009, and by now, queerness at Eurovision was becoming increasingly more visible and accepted. Serbian lesbian Maria Sherifovic won in 2007 with Molitva. She wasn't out at the time, but it's pretty clear what's happening here, with Verka Serduchka's drag act coming in second place above a slew of other queer and camp performances, though certainly no gay kisses. When Serbia hosted in 2008, they really leaned into the lesbian aesthetic aesthetic of Molitva with a full-on lesbian wedding. They were like, yes, lesbians, work that gender. So when Eurovision went to Russia in 2009, local LGBT activists wanted to leverage the international attention of Eurovision to organize a pride parade in Moscow on the day of the Eurovision final, despite the fact that the mayor had actually banned Pride as he had in the previous years. The parade was broken up by the police and at least 40 protesters were arrested. Sadly, Tatu's flower tanks didn't do much to advance gay rights that year in Russia. That year's winner, Alexander Rybak, said after the show,
"It's a little bit sad that they chose to have this parade today, because the biggest gay parade in the world was tonight, you know?"
2013 saw a particularly misogynist song about being a submissive wife to your husband suddenly reveal a surprise gay ending. Oh, I see. She's a submissive wife to her wife. Wow. What a twist. The performer, Krista Siegfried, stated that the kiss was meant as a message urging her country, Finland, to legalize same-sex marriage. Now, Eurovision is technically supposed to be apolitical. They're very clear about that.
Please remember that our motto is building bridges, and music should stand over politics tonight.
Yet, somehow, these gay marriage messages just keep getting through. So at this point, there seems to have been a precedent set by performances like Siegfried's and Ping Pong's that gay kisses at Eurovision don't usually come from queer performers, but are rather used for political and showbiz purposes. They tend to have this vibe of like, oh look, it's so heterosexual and wholesome, boom, it's gay, gotcha. In fact, as far as we can find, gay kisses in Eurovision have only been performed by straight people, or at least not anyone who's out. This means that the only queer performer who considered a gay kiss on stage, Tatu member Yulia Volkova, who actually turned out to be bisexual for real, was told no by Eurovision producers. Obviously, Tatu's kiss wasn't going to be genuine or wholesome and really would have been as much of the shock value as Ping Pong's, but how wild is it that Eurovision banned a gay kiss from Russia that was completely apolitical? But then again, I suppose we saw things very differently back in the 2000s, such as Terry Wogan with his UK commentary when he saw Serbia's very lesbian performance could only bring himself to constantly remark on how unattractive he found Maria Sherifovic.
Now this Maria is a homely looking girl. You see, looks aren't everything. It's that little strange-looking girl.
The UK's act that year was a pandering camp song full of innuendo and European flags, because surely that's enough to get every country to vote for you. Just wave their little flags and they say, oh, that's me, I'll vote for you, UK, I'll vote for you.
Pull firmly on the red cord and blow into the mouthpiece.
I understand pull on the red cord and blow into the mouthpiece is meant to be suggestive, but it is one of the more upsetting innuendos I think I've ever heard. Wogan was convinced, as people voted for Sherifovic and ignored the UK's beautiful pantomime, that it must be an Eastern Bloc conspiracy. The communists taking over Eurovision.
We're going to have to build a wall.
It seemed like Eastern Europe was too uncultured to see the heart and soul that went into the UK's song. I think that what the UK doesn't understand is whenever Brits threaten to come to another country, people assume they're either going to try and invade and colonise, or, more likely, get drunk and make a mess, neither of which is particularly fun for anyone else. Western Europe felt that the Eastern countries must be discriminating against them because the former commies didn't understand normal things like democracy and meritocracy and objectivity. They're corrupt and conniving, you see, as you would expect a communist to be. This had to be true rather than the idea that they were just sending good stuff. Where Western European artists would avoid something as tacky as Eurovision, Eastern artists were excited to go, sending the biggest, most popular stars in their regions, while Western Europe was sending camp flight attendants and turkey puppets. And it seems like the reason Western artists saw Eurovision as tacky and bad for their careers was at least in part because Terry Wogan made Eurovision into a joke. In Eastern Europe, it's taken more seriously, so they just send better content. But Wogan wasn't totally wrong about bloc voting. It is a thing. Countries commonly vote for their neighbours, but it's not really for political reasons, and certainly not for the sake of communism, but just because they share languages and culture and music markets. Singers popular in Serbia will also be popular in Croatia, while singers popular in the UK will also be popular in Ireland. In fact, Wogan didn't seem to have a problem with the fact that the only countries giving the UK any points were the ones that the UK had previously colonised.
So you see, you can always rely on the Irish.
If bloc voting were a real problem, the same countries would be winning every year. Eastern European countries just weren't winning disproportionately. They didn't even win win half the time, yet the West was convinced that a great injustice was happening to them. That same year, in 2007, Austria complained that the contest had become politicised, and they felt so victimised by Eastern Europe's success that they quit and didn't come back for another 3 years, ignoring their own history of political choices. Austria's song that very year was an activist anthem created for an HIV fundraiser, but I guess in their eyes that didn't count as politicising the contest, and yet Maria Sharifovic's love song did, because I guess she is Serbian. And a year after that, Terry Wogan was so convinced that his Eastern Bloc conspiracy theory was true that he quit his job as UK Eurovision commentator. So to try and appease the tantruming Western countries, Eurovision introduced juries to counterweight alleged bloc voting via the opinions of music industry professionals. So juries were literally introduced to Eurovision because of the prejudice towards Eastern Europe. Ironically, while the juries were supposed to make Eurovision more fair and meritocratic, they actually just ended up making it more corrupt. There have always been attempts to cheat at Eurovision, but trying to influence the televote is complicated and costly, whereas bribing a 5-member jury is much easier and much cheaper. There have been countless instances of juries being caught cheating over the years, as well as just not doing their job properly. In 2016, a live stream by a Russian jury member showed jurors on their phone not paying attention to the act, and a juror stating she would vote for Armenia because her husband was Armenian. And this panic over Eastern Europe dominating televote was all a bit pointless anyway. In the last 13 years, Eastern Europe had only won the televote twice, which means that even without the new jury system, Eastern Europe would not have dominated Eurovision. Because Eurovision now included so many countries, they introduced a pre-selection process, later becoming the 2 semi-finals, so that only the best of them would perform at the actual Eurovision finale. The first time Germany didn't make it, they felt incredibly victimised, and the EBU got a bit worried about the countries paying the most of the contest not making it to the final, so Eurovision ended up introducing the Big Five system, which grants these 5 large Western countries a direct entry into the final without having to compete in the semis to get there first. So today, despite being more inclusive of Eastern Europe, the whole of Eurovision is structured around giving big Western countries a special advantage, whether they actually send good performances or not. They still don't win, but, they could. In theory, they do their best. Not going to the semi-final means that they often show up to the final with a song that they don't know if Europe is actually going to like or not, and end up humiliated with 0 points in front of everyone.
And the United Kingdom gets 0 points.
It's strange to think that back in 2007, the narrative seemed to be that the West was being victimised by this Serbian lesbian and a little love song, when nowadays Eurovision has really built up this impression of a progressive Western Europe fighting for gay rights against the backwards primitive Eastern Europe. You saw it in Sweden's portrayal of themselves in 2013, praising their own progressive attitudes towards gay rights. You saw it in the constant booing of Russia in the following years. Graham Norton, the UK's current commentator, tends to be shocked when Eastern Europe votes for something queer.
She's not going to get 12s, I think, from Ukraine or Georgia or Slovenia.
Oh yes, of course, Graham, those countries aren't as advanced as the UK, even though Slovenia did send drag queens 12 years earlier and Ukraine did 7 years earlier, but let's see what they did give Conchita.
Austria.
L'Autriche.
I'm amazed Ukraine have given her that many points.
Austria. L'Autriche.
Now this is extraordinary. That was a country I really didn't think would give her a big vote.
Congratulations, Conchita. Austria, 12 points.
L'Autriche, 12 points.
And Georgia actually gave Conchita more points in the televote than the UK did. And UK gave Conchita the same number of televote points as Russia. Of course, in reality, some of the biggest queer and gender-bending acts have come from Central and Eastern Europe, including Serbia, Ukraine, Slovenia, Russia, Lithuania. The same as the Eastern Bloc voting accusations, this dichotomy of gay-friendly Western Europe and backwards homophobic Eastern Europe doesn't hold quite as much water as we like to think. We like to interpret the gay scandals of Eurovision as a West versus East thing, with enlightened countries like the UK and Sweden being grand protectors of all gay kind, and evil communist Eastern Europe as the homophobic villain. But really, this is a conflict within every country. While UK current commentator Graham Norton was happy about Conchita's win, even crying about it, his predecessor Terry Wogan called Conchita's performance a freak show. Here's Russia's 2021 entry praising trans icon Nikki Tutorials during a Eurovision interview.
You're sexiest woman I ever know, really talented and very, very brave.
Well, that's a way to start. Hello, welcome.
When Conchita's act was internally selected, it was a scandal. In Austria, there was a huge number of Austrians who didn't want to be represented by a bearded drag queen, but nobody interpreted that as Austria being an evil homophobic country. On the other hand, when Slovenia sent a drag act to Eurovision 12 years earlier, and some Slovenians protested that, their protests were discussed in the EU Parliament as proof that maybe Slovenia is too regressive to join the EU. When Russia introduced their anti-gay legislation in 2014, there were a number of Russian citizens and organizations who publicly protested it, including Russian Eurovision winner Dima Bilan. But that's not the fun narrative. We enjoy a good West versus East, a good democracy versus the evils of communism battle. And this goes back to the origins of Eurovision. The show was developed by an organization called the European Broadcasting Union, aka the EBU. Now, when the EBU was founded, there was an anxiety that Eastern Europe would dominate the broadcasting unions bringing together European TV stations. There's just too many of them, and that's way too many Eastern European votes. So the EBU was founded by Western countries such as the UK, France, Switzerland, and a distrust of the Eastern countries was officially baked into the fabric of the EBU. Of course, Eurovision was created to bring Europe together, to unite us through the universal language of music.
This competition was created in 1956 to unify a continent torn apart by war.
But the first Eurovision was all Western Europe. Eastern Europe gradually joined over the coming decades, but the tension never really went away. During the Cold War, Eastern Europe wanted to create a joint contest, but the EBU was like, no thank you. You should totally make your own Eurovision though. Oh, how fun would that be? Eastern European Vision, yay! Rara Rasputin! And they did. It was called Intervision, and unlike Eurovision, it opened its doors to all of Europe in 1968. So the first Eurovision that truly brought together Eastern, Western, and non-aligned countries wasn't Eurovision, it was Intervision. Intervision didn't actually last very long, but it was a thing. Eurovision's attitudes finally changed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Suddenly the vibe was all about uniting Europe, with a song with the chorus Unite, Unite Europe actually winning in 1990. Unite, unite Europe. So finally, Eastern European countries were in, which was so great until Eastern Europe won the contest a few times, and that just made Western Europe really uncomfortable. The animosity towards Eastern Europe goes way back, as far as the Enlightenment, when Western Europe developed an image of itself as uniquely civilized and special. Eastern Europe, as a backwards barbaric neighbour, was conceptualized in contrast. Eastern Europe was a scary place of poverty and superstition and rude, savage people, while Western Europe was a shining beacon of civilization and development. So Eurovision actually gave Eastern European countries an opportunity to prove to the West that they were just alike, just as modern and cultured, that we were all the same. When Ukraine last hosted while stalling for a performer who'd just run off, one of the hosts accidentally admitted to this directly.
We're tolerant, modern, and very open country.
And you could see in their hosting how they tried to convey the modernity of their Eurovision. When Serbia hosted in 2008 after Maria's win, the organisers said Eurovision would help change the stereotypical image of Serbia, and they used Eurovision to prove to the West, as CNN put it, that Serbia was a normal European nation. So branding is definitely a big part of what it means to host Eurovision, and sometimes that branding can be used to cover up the less palatable aspects of a country's reputation. The 2012 Eurovision was hosted by Azerbaijan, notorious for its poor record when it comes to democracy and media freedom. International observers have suggested that Azerbaijan had not had a free and fair election in 3 decades. They won the previous year with a song which sounds uncomfortably like a cry for help. And Azerbaijan already had a bad track record when it came to Eurovision. A few years earlier, due to a territorial dispute with Armenia, authorities had interrogated anyone in Azerbaijan who voted for Armenia's Eurovision song, saying it was a matter of national security. What are you, some kind of move your body sympathizer? 2012 was the most expensive Eurovision of all time. Azerbaijan bulldozed housing with people literally still inside the buildings to make way for their new Eurovision arena. And then, of course, they basically turned their Eurovision into a tourist campaign. Eurovision has an enormous potential to increase tourism in the region. Some countries will take the opportunity of hosting to basically turn the whole of Eurovision into an ad for tourism. They even get funding from tourism boards or governments. So becoming aware of the human rights issues, the Swedish contestant that year, Loreen, met with human rights activists in Azerbaijan, but when she was asked about it during a press conference, the organisers cut her off, suggesting such questions were inappropriate. There were several peaceful protests before Eurovision, but the authorities broke them up, allegedly at one protest also assaulting the protesters. But in the end, the branding worked. Eurovision helped to improve Azerbaijan's international image, even amongst those who didn't watch it, just based on media coverage. It was all pretty disturbing. Luckily, Azerbaijan did not win again that year. Interestingly, Loreen did, meaning the next Eurovision would be hosted in Sweden. And Sweden went all out to portray themselves as basically the opposite of Azerbaijan. They were fun and progressive, and they made a big deal about how they recycle and they love immigrants and they have gender equality and love LGBT people.
The Swedes are extremely independent and yet at the same time extremely tolerant.
But while definitely better than Azerbaijan in many ways, branding can still be misleading. Sweden doesn't recycle any more than, for example, the UK does. They just burn huge amounts of trash, including plastic, which is a whole new problem in and of itself. They are also not an immigrant utopia. Literally a day after the Swedish Eurovision final, there were riots due to the economic inequality and social exclusion of immigrants. And at the time they hosted, Sweden was actually sterilizing transgender people, not allowing them to transition unless they agreed to be sterilized. Sweden also neglected to mention that the telecommunications company, which allegedly spied on the people of Azerbaijan, like those who voted for Armenia in Eurovision, was owned by the Swedish government, and that company was also the main sponsor of the Swedish Eurovision. But none of that is what we remember when we look back on Eurovision 2013. We remember the great progressive Swedish Eurovision following Azerbaijan, with Pietra performing a pretend gay marriage on stage and pushing around recycle bins. We don't remember Sweden. We remember the Eurovision branding of Sweden. Now, of course, it's great when countries are dedicated to upholding LGBT rights, but that's different from turning it into branding, which is when it becomes a problem, like with Sweden, which has a history of turning its progressivism into a patriotic trait, into a symbol of what makes them exceptional and superior. This sort of branding is called homo-nationalism. And homo-nationalism can be used as a justification for all kinds of things. Maybe the government wants to keep immigrants out of their country. So suddenly the narrative becomes, well, those Eastern Europeans or those Middle Easterners, they're awfully homophobic now, don't you think? We should really try to keep them out of our country. Our just and noble government needs to protect the poor vulnerable gays, so maybe there's a good reason to increase police and military power so, the gays can still enjoy Grindr and Her. I'm just kidding, no one's enjoying Her. So while Eurovision was telling us this,
we're not just smorgasbord and social democrats. We also love a catchy tune.
The third biggest party in the Swedish parliament was an Islamophobic far-right party with Nazi roots, one of whose members was at the time organising pride parades in immigrant neighbourhoods to portray immigrants as inherently homophobic and thus fundamentally a threat to white, civilised, gay-loving Sweden. So this was literally the far-right using homo-nationalism to demonize immigrants. Homo-nationalism is so ingrained in global politics that we're currently seeing Ukrainians having to appeal to it in order to secure Western sympathy and support.
Україна вільна, сучасна, хоробра демократична країна, де визнають права.
Homo-nationalism sees the West as evolved, and any homophobia is just an individual problem, not a systemic one. But those other people in the East, on the other hand, they're not individuals with different perspectives. Their homophobia is inherent to their culture, and therefore systemic. They're forever stuck in the past, where the West is sort of, well, done already. We finished feminism. We actually fixed homophobia ages ago, so yeah. And that's kind of what you get from Sweden's Eurovision, a very depoliticized homo-nationalist gayness, a defanged gayness, which isn't going to contradict the message of how great and friendly their military is. When Sweden hosted in 2016, the original rules said that rainbow flags would only be tolerated in the audience as long as they were apolitical. So anyway, Israel's 2019 Eurovision prominently featured drag queens, a gay host talking about his husband and Grindr, opening with a performance from trans winner Donna International. Israel definitely leaned heavily into gay branding. And this was important because Israel really had something to prove. Their branding was in response to accusations that Israel is a settler colonial state on Palestinian land, that Israel is apartheid, treating Palestinians as second-class people, reminiscent of South African apartheid. Palestinians were effectively erased from Israel's Eurovision. The Palestinian flag was banned, and Palestinians kind of were too. Palestinians from the blockaded West Bank and Gaza, including queer Palestinians, are effectively banned from attending Eurovision. Activists who support Palestinians have also been told they will not be allowed into the country. So, for example, former Swedish Eurovision contestant Erik Saade, who is half Palestinian, may have himself had trouble getting into the country via the airport because Palestinians and people of Palestinian origin are subject to extended, sometimes hostile questioning and often just refused entry into the country and sent back. When Saade delivered the jury votes from Sweden that year, he made an ambiguous remark about not being able to be in Israel this year.
Thank you for a great show. I really wish I was there, but I'm not. Maybe next year.
Maybe.
So Israel's branding needed to be clear. Israel is not colonial. It's not like South Africa was. It is a normal European nation, as CNN might put it. And one great way to do that is homonationalism, to brand the country as a gay haven, civilized, modern. And Grindr jokes are actually quite good for that, to be honest. And this isn't just a Eurovision tactic. Israel has an official campaign called Brand Israel, which has invested $90 million into specifically marketing Israel as a gay tourist destination, depicting it as modern and progressive in contrast with its Middle Eastern neighbours. Don't look at Eric Saade being unable to enter Israel to come to Eurovision because of his ethnic background. Please watch these fun drag queens and relax and have a good time. In response to all this, that year's Icelandic act Hattari snuck in Palestinian flags in protest, and Madonna's interval performance included a dancer wearing an Israeli flag and a dancer wearing a Palestinian flag, embracing as a symbol of peace. This was not welcomed by the organisers, and Hattari were actually fined €5,000 for just holding up flags, and Madonna was apparently scolded for her performance. Because Eurovision is meant to be apolitical, right? Well, in theory, any sort of politicization or instrumentalization of Eurovision is banned, but in practice, the EBU seems to distinguish between two different kinds of politics at Eurovision, one of which is acceptable and the other is not. State politics are unacceptable. For example, in 2009, the EBU rejected Georgia's entry for being a barely concealed dig at Russia's President Putin. But on the other hand, values politics are just fine and dandy. Everyone loves a vague song about peace and love and freedom. They're just about values. Peace, peace, love, love, and a man in a hamster wheel. Humanitarian messages are also allowed, such as the French song Mercy, which was about a real baby girl born on a refugee rescue boat after her pregnant mum was saved from a dangerous dinghy. So, if peaceful humanitarian messages are considered values politics and therefore allowed, you would think that peace with Palestine would count as a basic humanitarian message, right?
Israel and the Eurovision Song Contest have proven once more that prejudice, hate, racism, sexism, exclusion do not stand a chance.
But in reality, any reference to Palestine or Palestinians seems to have been banned from the competition, messages of peace included. Surely that banning in and of itself would count as state politics, and state politics are not allowed, right? During Israel's postcards for each song, they showed footage of Israel, but sometimes illegally occupied land, which, under international law, is not recognized as being part of Israel. The United Nations has suggested that Israeli settlements in occupied territories should be considered a war crime. So the show was literally using the tourism branding of Eurovision to tell the world, hey, this land belongs to us. Please, gays, come spend your holiday money here. We have Grindr.
A certain app that is on fire right now because of all the handsome tourists in Tel Aviv.
In fact, when Israel won the previous year, there had been hopes to host Eurovision in Jerusalem.
Next time in Jerusalem!
Except Jerusalem is a contested city, also claimed by Palestine. To host in Jerusalem would have been a bold political move. So I guess they just settled for bold political postcards instead. Which makes sense, because those postcards serve as tourism ads for Israel. And Israel was already listing Airbnb and other tourist services in their illegally occupied territories. The year following Israel's Eurovision saw a huge tourism boom, as you'd expect after a country hosts Eurovision. So given that Israel instrumentalized Eurovision as propaganda and a tourist ad for illegally occupied territories, why were Hattari and Madonna the ones to get in trouble with the EBU? Did Madonna really say much more than peace, peace, love, love? Which one of these is state politics here, and which one is values politics? The DVD version of Eurovision 2019 excludes Madonna entirely and also cuts out the clip of Hattari with the Palestinian flag, but keeps in all the postcards of illegally occupied territory, effectively endorsing Israel's political message and completely erasing Palestine from Eurovision. Was this really the apolitical way to deal with the issue of Israel and Palestine? But this isn't the first time Eurovision's policy has seemed contradictory. We told you about the Mercy refugee song, which was allowed, and Sweden in 2016 actually had an interval performance about refugees trying to draw attention to their struggles. But the following year, when soon-to-be winner Salvador Sobral wore an SOS Refugees jumper to a press conference, the EBU asked him to stop wearing it because they saw it as political.
Make no mistake, these people are not immigrants, you know? They're refugees running away from death.
So which is it? Is caring about refugees values politics and allowed, or is it state politics and forbidden? Maybe Sobral was just too open about how governments can be at fault for how refugees are treated. But then why is gay marriage always allowed at Eurovision going back to 2008? Siegfried's in 2013 said specifically her performance was about legalizing same-sex marriage in Finland, which is clearly state politics and much more tangible than anything Sobral said. So what are the politics of Eurovision? It clearly has a political agenda. Maybe that agenda is simply to unite Europe. That's what it was created for after all. Right?
This competition was created in 1956 to unify a continent torn apart by war.
Well, not exactly. I mean, not at all, actually. In fact, we've been lying to you, but only because Eurovision did it first. The EBU comes from a long legacy of unions managing European telegraph and radio connections. They are a pragmatic, technical organisation. And in the 1950s, it was their job to come up with content for this new television technology, which was taking off across Europe. So they came up with this idea for a European Song Contest, a quick, cheap and easy broadcast, an hour and 20 minutes. They didn't even plan on doing a second one. It would be in the same vein as like the Football Cup, a cool exercise in this newfangled concept of international TV broadcasting. After all, it's cheaper to create one TV program and show it in a bunch of different countries than it is to create a bunch of TV programs all over the place. So this seemed perfect. The truth is, there was no romantic vision of bringing Europe together through the power of music after Europe was torn apart by war. It was just a cheap and easy way to make a TV show. And the project actually had to remain apolitical because that's the most efficient way to get shit done. They would never meddle with governments or the EU because that would only hold them back, overly complicate things. But they also understood the power of television, that it can be a deadly weapon of propaganda and controlled information. And the EBU wanted to avoid all of that in their little song competition. But easier said than done. Countries understood immediately that Eurovision was a great way to brand themselves. From Germany sending a Holocaust survivor and an American to the very first contest in 1956, to Franco's Spain in the following 2 decades, using Eurovision to gloss over its fascist dictatorship and promote its tourism. Countries have always known how to use Eurovision to send political messages. And the EBU has always positioned itself as apolitical, and later reinforced that with rules keeping Eurovision songs and artists in check. But being the arbiter of what counts as political is, in itself, a political act. To decide Siegfried's Gay Marriage Act is apolitical is a political choice. To decide that gay rights are apolitical is political. To allow Israel's branding to include illegally occupied territories is political. But what do you do when, for example, a European country invades another European country? We've established before that invading other countries outside of Europe is fine. The UK faced no consequences for invading Iraq in 2003. Israel has faced no consequences, regardless of whether they've committed illegal acts or war crimes. So what about Russia after the invasion of Ukraine? They got kicked out, right? Well, no, not to begin with. After the Russian invasion began, Ukraine asked for Russia to be expelled from both the EBU and Eurovision, and the EBU said no, Russia would be allowed to stay. So why was Russia eventually expelled? Well, because in the end, 10 other countries complained, and some even threatened to withdraw from Eurovision if Russia was allowed to compete. And suddenly, the EBU changed their mind and said, in light of the unprecedented crisis in Ukraine, the inclusion of a Russian entry in this year's contest would bring the competition into disrepute. That's what it really comes down to. Disrepute. They're not uniting Europe, they're making a TV program, and they want the TV program to avoid disrepute. Eurovision has always had a sizable gay fandom, and especially now when gay rights are so widely acceptable, perhaps it would bring Eurovision into disrepute to turn down a gay performance like Siegfried's. Though apparently that wasn't a concern back in 2003 when these topics were more controversial. The issues with Israel aren't a real problem because very few people in Europe care about them. An attempt at boycotting Israel's Eurovision in 2019 fell pretty flat, barely putting a dent in the viewing figures. But when Russia invaded Ukraine and 11 countries were all complaining and some were threatening to leave Eurovision, that was enough to put the show in danger of disrepute and force the EBU to respond. So no, Eurovision was not created to bring Europe together, and even today, that's not really the function, it's just cute branding. Eurovision is just a TV program trying to put on a good show while desperately trying to avoid any kind of political controversy. And avoiding controversy isn't necessarily about doing the apolitical thing. So Eurovision tends to be characterised by a hell of a lot of politics, both behind the scenes and on stage, while the EBU stands in front saying, nothing to see here, folks. This is just a normal song competition. Everything's fine. Please don't look at them doing this. There are so many great things about Eurovision. I love being exposed to cultures that otherwise don't have a chance to compete with the American and Western music dominating the global charts. For 1 week a year, music from Moldova and Latvia has the same platform as music from the UK and Sweden. It's so incredible to get to hear songs in languages like North Sami and Sranantong, or such small languages which I'd never had the opportunity to hear before. And it's so fun to look back on all these historical milestones in Eurovision. The first openly gay artist, the first drag act, the first woman wearing trousers at Eurovision, because that was a thing back then. There's a reason Eurovision is one of Europe's most popular TV events. Unlike other international mega events like the Olympics, Eurovision is a democracy, allowing the European audience to have a voice and shape the outcome each year. Eurovision has launched global stars and given us iconic songs. Its peculiar format has even helped create a whole new music genre, Europop. Eurovision shows us a Europe that does right by its minorities, be it ethnic or LGBT, a Europe that has atoned for its past, where all countries have an equal chance, regardless of their size, or history, or EU membership. Eurovision shows us a very authentic European culture, which is fun and goofy and communicated in a mishmash of broken English and local languages. This is the cosmopolitan, progressive and peace-loving Europe that we know and love, where the villains are booed and the heroes win. But it's not real. This perfect Europe that exists in Eurovision is an ideal, a utopia, a flattering image of how Europe wants to see itself, not how it really is. And unless we're aware of its artificial nature, those dreams of an equal, peaceful Europe can be exploited to cover up reality, and minorities can be turned into a symbol and a tool instead of actually being uplifted. We create the illusion that the problem is other countries, other peoples, other ethnicities, different backgrounds. But if we really want a better world, then, as the Slovenians say, we gotta sweep our own doorsteps first. There's so much more to say about Eurovision, and we're going to be continuing the conversation over on our Patreon because we did so much research and have so much more to say about it. So if you want to check out more Eurovision content and also support the channel, please consider joining us over on the Patreon. Otherwise, smash all those buttons, everything except the dislike, please. And, ring the little bell. Thank you so much to all of our patrons, and a special thanks to Elicante, Aaron, AJ Mango, Alexis, Alice Lovell, All Ducks Rock, Amelia D, Andrew Kokemore, Angela, Anya Stephen, Anton North, Arden, Ariel Rodriguez, Artemix, Ariota, B, Basute, Besna Plaza, Beslaf, Beth, Byroni, Break Every Yoke, Brian Espinoza, Bump Girl, C'est Moi, Carmen, Carson Harder Hyde, Casey Poivert, Katrina Lexi, Charis Edwards, Charlotte Hollingsworth, Chelsea S, Chloe G, Chloe Strange, CJ Gibson, Claire, Clemence Levergler, Cleo McKeever, Colleen French, Comfort and Adam, Daniel, David, Dax, Deanna McMillan, Devon as usual, Didrill, Divoleserine, 120416, Dorothy, Dr. Most Beautiful Duck, second duck we've had, Dropout Ninja, Dylan Reed, Eden Ladley, Iriembi, Elizabeth Early, Eliza, L like the L word, Elora Woolmisley, Elsie Astro, Emma Bales, Emery James Fairgrieve, Erica Nisland, Erica Lygren, Eve Griffith, Faye Crossroads, Fancy Angles, Fickle Harpy, Fluffy Bunny Boo, Fox E, Gabriella Day, Game Guy J, Gavin Salmon, Gerald Brenter, Ghosts and You Might Die, Ginger, Grace Robertson, Grisella Farben, Gwilym Perez, Gwenda Euphoria, Hannah Burgess, Hayley Labang, Helena Barbarouses, Hyrius of Eleuthane, Hunka Munka, Hertzville, Ira Zenon, Issy Kostov, Jackie Queen of Thieves, Jam Kosowski, Jamie Midge, Jennifer Fronister, Gillian D, Joe McManus, Joey Mayer, Jose Suazo, Jules Inkwell, Juliana Baca, Julio Leote, Julio Mendez, Julia Sarwin, Juniper Lopez, Kale, Kaleidoscopic, Cornelius, Kata, Katharina Glomb, Katie Bollinger, Katya, Kay Sarah, Kelly Flynn, Kelp, Chris P, Kyle Denley, Lee Fowler, Lewis McLeod, Lee Headstrom, Leanna Laymore, Lindsay Mercer, Lauren E., Lisa Spitalovitz, Logan K., Lorelei McLaughlin, Lumpy Llama, Mary Bass, Mario, Marla Nolting, Mama Reed, Marim, Math Class Warfare, Malka, Maxim Shulin, McKenning Wood, Meg, Metavor, Mia Nilo, Mo, Mochibun, Mugsy, Moomin Puppet, Moshe Gordon Radian, Munmai Salil, Mathete, Mirren McGlynn, Niall Heron, Nicholas Venturo, Nick Snary, Nina Vangberg, Non-Anonymous, Nora Carlson, Nullbuild, Oli1234, Ossia Matthew, Panny Lynn, Paul Stevenson, Potato King, Pseudo Pac-Man, Public L, Rachel Rat, Rochelle, Radical Planning, Rebecca Peacock, Reese Enghart, River Felix, River Haddock, RSS, Ruxandra Greco, Sarah Buchelman, Sarah R, Saria, Shoxtopia, Sean Haskett, Selenia Latovara, Sean, She Algorithm, Sierra Kaplan Nelson, Sierra Rhodes, Sylvia, Simon Martin, Simon Patience, Sithvich, Soham Beneria, Sophie, Stephen Wallace, Summertime Killer, Susie S, T. Thomas, Talia Parkinson, Tara Hilliard, Teb9893, Taylor White, Theo Falling, Thistlecat, Thomas Ersing, Tiago, Tim Anderson, Tiny Wooden Tree, Troy Zaire, Valeria, Verlux, Vicious Panda, Vicky Green, Victoria Cherepanova, Vince Whitaker, Wandering Sock, Wards, Wesley Botham, Will O'Connor, Jonathan Zunga, and Zach.